Cafe Cabaret, and we are in the second week of our series, Humor in the American Tradition. The Wrong Hero presents Tradition. This is a 10-week series, and we are in the second week. This programming is produced by Francis DiMenno. And now, The Wrong Hero presents Tradition. Hello, I'm The Wrong Hero, and welcome to the second week of the seminar, which I have entitled Humor and Comedy in the American Tradition. And this week's segment is in fact called Tradition. And I will read the prospectus to the course prior to commencing. Humor is an effective tool in many situations, from breaking the ice in social settings to conveying an ostensibly serious message. Some entertainers utilize a familiar persona to underscore their humor. Others rely upon wordplay, paradox, and familiar concepts combined with unfamiliar points of view. Even a casual examination of the work of successful humorists reveals a common thread which unites their efforts, the element of confounded expectations. The purpose of this course is twofold: to examine a wide range of humorous writings and monologues, and in so doing to enable the student to develop a humorous persona of his or her own. Well, I have deviated somewhat from the lesson plan, and all of the humorous material is in fact in bound notebooks and not available to you, and I'm not going to read it as it's all copyrighted material. But however, I will give the lecture which accompanies the readings, and if you feel as though you're being cheated and only getting half of what you paid for, consider this. I'm doing this for nothing, so it's not like you've really been cheated out of anything now. Well, I had a lot more to say in my introductory segment. Perhaps I should just zip through the key points. Well, humor is based on conflict. Humor depends upon a comic frame, in the words of Kenneth Burke. The humorist looks at the world through a comic frame, which allows man to transcend occasions when he has been tricked or cheated. There's the phone. Let me get it, and I'll be right back. Well, last week we talked a bit about humor, and I think this week we talked a little bit about the traditions of humor. Well, way back when there was the Japanese comic drama, Kyogen. One of its main themes has its analogs in low comedy and commedia dell'arte. The smart, opportunistic servant who outwits his blockhead master. The rise of comedy from the spirit of upward mobility. I am citing John Simon. Now, there are other high points in the history of humor that perhaps we should attempt to discuss. And those have a good deal to do with the United States, only because the focus of this course is, in fact, the United States. John Updike has noted that American masterpieces like Moby Dick and Huckleberry Finn dealt with marginal situations and eccentric, rootless characters. And that seems to be quite a leitmotif in comedy in general in this country. Marginal situations and rootless, eccentric characters. Now, the modern day stand-up comedian did not emerge full-blown, but rather the set and setting that the comedian operates in arose out of vaudeville. As a matter of fact, prior to vaudeville, there were freak shows, circuses, traveling troupes. There were all sorts of things going on prior to vaudeville. Medicine show type presentations where a barker would give off a somewhat humorous spiel audience shouted out for some of the remedy offered at $1 a bottle. Of course, you know, these patent medicines had a lot of alcohol in them, and a lot of people who wouldn't be seen drinking moonshine liquor were more than happy to glug down this stuff, which was 70 proof, thinking that it helped them. My rheumatism medicine. Anyway, according to Frank Rose, freak shows evolved rapidly into vaudeville during the 1880s, in Boston as a matter of fact. The first vaudeville show was basically the Fiji Mermaid and a midget, and then they added some comedians, and vaudeville got started. When vaudeville faded in the 1920s, William Morris took his acts to radio, movies, TV. At each transition, it was the talent agent who had the attraction that people wanted to see. Now, talking for a moment about farce, which of course is an integral element of comedy. Farce originated in Roman times as an interlude, a buffoonish mime of reality between more serious dramas. I'll murder you with your own bare hands, tit for tat. It is the oldest part of farce. And vaudeville also had its farcical interludes, and eventually those farcical interludes developed into two-man acts, and eventually those transmogrified into the one-man solo act. Now, in discussing myth, it might be helpful if we go back to what Freud said about art and myth. Freud said that art and myth are rationalizations rather than literal portrayals of forbidden impulses. And, you know, last week I was saying this a lot, but I'm going to continue to say it because it's just so apropos. That's what comedy is. Rationalizations rather than literal portrayals of forbidden impulses. It's like a policeman stops me, says, you were speeding. Can you tell me why I pulled you over? Well, I said, either it's because they ran out of donuts at the donut shop, or you're too frightened to chase after real criminals and you'd rather harass honest citizens like me. And, you know, this is just like a standard joke. I mean, the authority figure versus the essentially powerless but sharp-tongued protagonist. And although powerless, the protagonist overcomes through his mother wit. And yet, it didn't really happen, and so it's a rationalization of a forbidden impulse. Now, James Bowman has said that one definition of the word myth is a story that people don't get tired of telling or hearing. Like, take my wife, please. That, in its most concise form imaginable, is a myth. The great writers of the past speak of the eternal values that have to do with the centering of our lives, says Joseph Campbell. Well, that may be, but the comedian seems to follow a somewhat aberrant course. The comedian talks about the decentering of our lives. He talks about the displacement of the individual in a modern mass society, to a great extent. Basically, his is a one-man stand. Now, in order to have a semblance of purposeful behavior on this earth, you have to believe that things are right and wrong. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, says Joan Didion. And to a certain degree, she is very, very accurate. In order for there to be comedy, there does have to be an internalized sense of right and wrong, because there is no humor in a situation in which there is no conflict. And the conflict between right and wrong is one of those conflicts which is treated so often in comedy. But generally, the comedian is the persona who is the wronged individual, and the forces of society which seek to suppress his individuality are the ones which wronged him. And so his entire story is basically me versus the world. Of course, it might be helpful to mention at this point that Nietzsche said that in the struggle between you and the world, back to the world. And there is a certain aspect of that in comedy, too. And in the phrase, If you don't know that such and such has happened, you must have been living in a cave for most of your life. Anyway, that which is most enduring in the human enterprise, the power of man to define himself against the ravages of time through artistic style. That's what Ralph Ellison said. Cohen, in his book on Southwestern humor, talks about Southwestern humor is representing something new, because he said that with Southwestern humor, rich figurativeness was accompanied by unrestrained exaggeration. So mean he was caught one day stealing acorns from a blind hog, for example. And this was one of our first forms of native humor, which it was Southwestern humor, as so called. Now, although the use of dialects was not yet new, this kind of language was. It combined the wild imagination of the frontiersman with the concreteness of poetry, which of course is more of a high art medium. And again, when people weren't going to freak shows and traveling circuses and religious revivals and medicine shows, they were talking among themselves, spinning tall tales. And frontier humor, Southwestern humor, was in fact one of the expressions of that impulse that people utilized. Vincent Crapanzano says of myth, whatever delight the study of myth brings, it also brings terror, the terror of an endless seduction whose terms and purposes are never certain. Just as you think you figure out what a myth means, you discover a new version which contradicts as often as it confirms the meaning you think you've uncovered. Yet, all the versions of a myth, indeed all myths, seem reducible at some level to a single story. By repeating it, the student of mythology becomes a myth maker too. And I think that the single story of myth is the individual versus the world. Now, like language, Levi-Strauss argued, myths are structured in terms of binary opposites. Just as meaning is carried at the level of sound by oppositions between, say, nasal and non-nasal, at the level of myth it is carried by oppositions between, say, the high and the low, the sky and the earth, upstream and downstream, the relations between the opposing terms, not the symbolism of the terms themselves, and not their narrative progression give myths their meaning. Just to put it in a more simple way, it's not this hand, it's not that hand, it's the knitting together of the fingers which holds the meaning that the myth has. Now, myth makers, like their audiences, are always trapped in their creations and the delusions they produce. So if you've ever been wondering why comedians are so weird, that's one reason. Now, I'm just crossing out some stuff here. Sophocles, the message of Sophocles in the Oedipus cycle, as cited by John Lear, is, you ignore the realm of unconscious meaning at your own peril. Do so, and Oedipus's fate will be yours. So, you know, myths are scary things. You don't want to monkey with them if you can avoid it. The reason I'm getting into myths is because we have to talk about tradition, the tradition of humor in the American vernacular. And what better way to do it than to make a set of pronouncements about myths so that you have some background. Now, Garrison Keillor actually stated in the February 1996 issue of The Atlantic, experience becomes literature when it no longer matters to the reader whether the story is true or not. And I think the same thing is true of the comic monologue. It's funny, not necessarily because it's true, or even in spite of the fact that it's not true, but simply because whether it's true or not doesn't matter. It's funny. Now, let's talk a little bit about America. In America, says William Faulkner, the past is never dead. It isn't even past. George Luis Borges said of patriotism, only affirmations were tolerated. Humor works against this impulse of mindless affirmation. In fact, the comedian constitutes to a certain degree an anti-hero. Comedy is an anti-heroic device, a deflator of hopes and assumptions. As Peter Phillips said, like every nation on earth, we admire the hero figure who is, in the non-pejorative sense of the word, egregious. Now, Leslie Fiedler in Love and Death in the American Novel has stated, the good bad boy is, of course, America's vision of itself, crude and unruly in his beginnings, but endowed by his creator with an instinctive sense of what's right. Stephen Stark has stated, America is full of the defiant oppositional anger that often characterizes the early adolescent. And compared to some of the more ancient nations on earth, such as Greece, Rome, China, India, we are, in fact, as a peoples in our adolescence. An appetite for entertainment unknown in human history, says Pete Hamill. The American imagination is jammed with the structures of melodrama, and the essence of drama is conflict. And stand-up comedy monologues being miniaturized dramas, going all the way back to epic poetry, Greek drama, oratory, fable, insult contests. Stand-up comedy is like a drama, and the essence of drama is conflict. Now, some of the archetypal conflicts are found in the Bildungsroman of the German folk tales. For example, village idiot seeks adventure and finds wisdom the hard way. Boy goes to war and returns changed. Person discovers true self in exotic land. Boy becomes man after sex with mature woman. Anal retentive finds self after freaking out and nearly committing suicide. Now, to translate this into an American milieu, the military and or marital bounder as moral crusader is a traditional American theme, and the telling might better be left to some modern Hawthorne or Dreiser. Now, Theodore Dreiser, of course, in his trilogy, The Financier, The Titan, and the third volume of that, which nobody ever seems to have read, talks very much about the bounder as moral crusader. Dreiser's big thing was, I please myself. That is what his eponymous hero, based on Yerkes, the traction magnate, said in the first volume of that trilogy. Now, more about growing up stories, since America is in fact a nation in its metaphorical adolescence. These Bildungsromans, these coming-of-age stories, are a very important leitmotif in the tradition of American literature in general. And to a certain degree, this filters down, all the way down into perhaps the most compact form of American literature, the stand-up monologue. In growing up stories, says John Gray, age is the ultimate editor. In retrospect, the worst of times, a war, a depression, a bad trip, becomes the best of times, a good yarn, a Bildungsroman for a generation, to be polished and retold with nostalgic relish, for life will never again be so intense. In other words, the old syndrome of, well, at least I'll have something to tell to my grandchildren. And it's creating triumph out of adversity. It is milking adversity to create advantage, and that is, in sum, what the stand-up comedian does. The experiences of youth create habits that can last a lifetime. People who shared powerful experiences in young adulthood can be grouped into lifelong cohorts that share certain attitudes and consumer behavior, citing Meredith and Shua. An Arab proverb puts it more succinctly: men resemble the times more than they do their fathers. Now here's something interesting. Lloyd DeMauza says, psychohistory asserts that nations have psychologies, dreams and fantasies that can be analyzed, urges that arise from the childhood fears and traumas of their populace. So let's say my cohort, which came of age during the late 60s and early 70s, just take that as an example of a cohort. Well, coming of age, we actually came of age in 1978 or thereabouts. We reached our majority then. We were the largest cohort in history. That's why it's so damn hard to find a job. What are our childhood fears and traumas? Well, we lived in an age of, in our childhood, it was an age of expansion. As we grew older, just as we grew old enough to understand what was going on around us, it became an age of shortages and contractions. And throughout the 80s, it became an age of untrammeled greed. And here in the 90s, we are paying the piper. We are the paying the piper generation. The American public is interested in just three things: blood, money, and the female organ of sexual intercourse, says the uncharitable A.J. Liebling in one of his more cynical moments. The cynicism and the sanctimony turn out to be a little like electricity and magnetism, two aspects of a single field perpetuating themselves in a thought-free vacuum. This is Adam Grofnick, and he's talking about an American mindset. Cynicism versus sanctimony. The cynicism of the Wall Street arbitrageurs of the 80s versus the sanctimony of the moral majority, which have transmogrified themselves into, say, the Promise Keepers, the religious right, the evangelicals. As a matter of fact, they've joined forces and they're now called the Republican Party, but that's not within the scope of my discussion this week. Puritanism, says Lance Morrow, is the oldest ghostly American mind-body reflex. This Puritanism, which comes to us, of course, from the colonial era, still pervades the American psyche, but in the 1880s and 90s and 1800s and early 1900s, it was blasphemy, which was proscribed, and profanity, which was frowned upon. Here in the 90s, it's racial slurs, which tend to evoke the same puritanical response. Not that blasphemy or racial slurs are good, it's just an observation. The value of cultural literacy is intangible, and in the pragmatic tradition of the frontier, we abandoned it. And that's why it's so hard to relate. Individualism, pragmatism, and materialism have all contributed to the depletion of the American mythology, says Yvonne Sanger. With traditional American distaste for ambiguity, we have rejected culture itself because it is flawed, because it is unappealing, because it is human. And what we have erected in its place, of course, is the culture of celebrity, which is, of course, my own addendum to Yvonne Sanger's remarks about culture. Orwell was right about the vein of vulgarity running more or less uncensored through earlier English literature. English literature during the Elizabethan era was pretty uninhibited. A cursory reading of Hamlet would certainly show you that a great many things were discussed that would perhaps not have been so freely discussed in the milieu of, say, the 1890s. In fact, there was a cottage industry of expurgated and Baudelaireized Shakespeare because some of the immortal bard's works were considered unfit for a family audience. Nowadays, what we have is postmodernism, and Stanley Kaufman has said that Postmodernism may ultimately dwindle as an aesthetic, but it surely has some use as a stance. And again, we have this cynicism that takes the place of rational thought. I think it was put very well by Russell Lynes, who stated, "Cynicism is the intellectual cripple's substitute for intelligence. It is the dishonest businessman's substitute for conscience. It is the communicator's substitute, whether he is an advertising man or editor or writer, for self-respect." So, cynicism, bad. That's what I'm getting at here. And Americans are cynical because they are a polyglot peoples and they don't have a united culture. And what united culture they once had is rapidly dwindling and becoming the province of historians. It is my attempt in this discussion, ostensibly about comedy, to attempt to rectify this somewhat in a discussion of comedy. And in order to discuss comic traditions, I need to talk a little bit about tradition itself, and that is why this presentation is entitled Tradition. Now, it has been said, the more things change, the more things stay the same. And Chris Clausen makes a very valid point when he talks about the weekly world news. Why is it important to know about Southwestern humor? Well, in the weekly world news, nowhere in America does the old-fashioned Southwestern humor of exaggeration flourish so luxuriantly. The stuff of tall tale and folklore, the modern equivalent to the tall tales that fulfill a wide range of psychological needs for our ancestors. Chris Clausen also goes on to state, the tabloids merely cater, albeit at the extreme, to American culture's obsession with personality and generally weak interest in abstract ideas, political or otherwise. Harold Bloom states, we have not had an official high culture in this country since about 1800, which of course was about the time we started definitely thoroughly drifting away not only from the English crown but from English traditions in general. And what replaced them? The humor of the frontier. Of course, there were some remnants of the British tradition, such as Nathaniel Hawthorne, and of the European tradition, such as Washington Irving, still plying their craft, but that became slowly replaced by practitioners such as Melville, the world-weary wandering sailor, and Mark Twain, the frontiersman, teller of tall tales, and many, many more. There was a third name, Walt Whitman, an intrinsically American poet creating a style which was unique. Today's popular taste, says Richard Corliss, is ruled by the gaudy, the facetious, and the nostalgic. The merchandise sold in the studio stores speaks to all these impulses. It's the cultural industrial complex at its acme, iconography retooled for fun and profit. You know, in the old days, a fellow might buy a ship in a bottle, or a Bowie knife, or maybe a knick-knack manufactured in Germany. But nowadays they buy a porcelain statuette of Mickey Mouse in the Sorcerer's Apprentice segment of Fantasia. Television, according to Paula Wagner, has become our contemporary mythology. American diversity has no common ground but that of the lowest common denominator. That we have become the land of the bathroom joke was a foregone conclusion, writes Florence King. Well, I'm not quite so sure I agree with her that the only intrinsically American form of humor is the bathroom joke, but again, there is a certain connection to the old style frontier humor, which scatology was certainly not out of bounds, nor for that matter was blasphemy or profanity. Dwight MacDonald, that eternal malcontent, in one of his essays, stated that America's real motto is, I got mine and screw you, Jack. Now, culture can be defined as all of the characteristic activities and interests of a people. T.S. Eliot has stated that the term culture has different associations according to whether we have in mind the development of an individual, of a group, or of a class, or of a whole society. It is a part of my thesis, he goes on to state, that the culture of the individual is dependent upon the culture of a group or class, and that the culture of a group or class is dependent upon the culture of a whole society to which that group or class belongs. And if, in fact, all of these dire prognostications of Americans having no culture are accurate, that would mean that groups have no real culture and individuals have, as parts of groups, also have no real cultures. Frost, that is Robert Frost, in citing Phoebe Pettingill, Frost's creed was that although a writer may work alone, he is connected in spirit to the people and culture around him. But of course, in a country which supposedly has no culture other than sanitized vacuum tube culture as seen on television, and to a lesser extent in Hollywood, Americans have no culture. And what does a writer have to work with? Well, one thing that a writer who is defined by his oppositional viewpoint to reality has to work with is this lack of culture, the debasement of myths in modern America. Florence King said, culture piped through a great vanity emerges as great culture, but democratically elected leaders must pretend to be no better than anybody else. The pretense, which seldom strains credulity, elevates the lowest common denominator. And what exactly is the culture of the lowest common denominator, I would like to know. If in fact, by its very definition, the lowest common denominator has no real culture as we recognize it, except television and movies and radio talk shows and the like. Well, if we have no culture, as all of these gloomy gusses insist on reasserting, perhaps what we do have is the American character, which has been characterized as lighthearted, good in his work, sociable but independent, practical but a dreamer. Let's get back to those two last pairings. Sociable but independent, and practical but a dreamer. Americans do have a culture, it's just that it's not the officially recognized high culture of a fast-dwindling minority, nor is it the mass culture that virtually everybody is familiar with. American culture is the culture of Americans' aspirations more than it is any one readily definable thing. And what the American basically aspires to is wanting to make a living, have a family, settle down, but also to indulge himself in following his own path. In other words, an individual but inextricably linked to a society, sociable but independent, practical but a dreamer. Stephen Hayward has said, all regimes are vulnerable to a kind of corruption specific to their principles, and the corruption of American culture is also specific to the principles behind the individual Americans' aspirations, hopes, and dreams. In other words, they are fast becoming estranged from the very big government which their votes helped put into power. And that is a form of corruption. Many Americans have given up on the very democracy which is the backdrop for much of the American character, or lack thereof. Now, according to Virginia I. Postrel, the paradox of America is that we have built a history and tradition, a national culture, in defiance of history and tradition. Los Angeles and Atlanta and the vast regions of which they are the capitals, the South and the West are the well springs of American culture. The Puritans came from England. Pentecostalism was born in the United States. The way Gary Allen Fine put it was, Our wilderness is our freedom. And once again, this brings us all the way back to the tradition of Southwestern humor, of which I do have a great deal to say. Now, the form of the fable takes as its form a surface simplicity, a seductive imagery, and gently instinctive resonances. That is the form of a fable. Now here is an example of Southwestern humor in the form of a fable. There's no use trying to out-cute a hillbilly boy, as the traveling salesman found out when he stopped the boy over at the creek and said, "Hey kid, how far is it, a mile or so up the creek?" "Oh," said the kid, "I reckon it's about 5 times as long as a fool, so just lay down and start measuring." Now, contrast this to the English model of the comic fable. A music hall comedian was holding forth when a heckler interrupted him. He said to the heckler, "Are you the front end of a donkey?" "No, sir." "Are you the rear end of a donkey?" "No, sir." "Well then, you must be no end of an ass." And that is all the difference in the world between the form of Southwestern humor and the form of wordplay heavy British humor. I will now take a short break, and we'll discuss Southwestern humor in more of its details. Well, frontier humor, as it has been expressed in Professor Cohen's Humor of the Old Southwest, a basic text among English majors in college. Frontier humor had its heyday from 1835 to 1860. It was revived by Mark Twain roughly around 1879, 80, about the time he wrote Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, and again revived by Faulkner and by Robert Penn Waring in the 1930s, as Professor Cohen states in his preface. And the reason I draw upon Professor Cohen is because he wrote the definitive work in the field. I should get up and show it to you. Perhaps I will at the end of the presentation if there's time. Professor Cohen talks about the need to distinguish between the teller and the protagonist of the tale in Southwestern humor. An elite raconteur who described the doings of low-life characters while holding himself above and apart. This procedure emphasized social and political distinctions which are significant, but it occasionally blurred those moments when low-life is simply something quaint, extravagant, clownish, perhaps grotesque. The low-life figure described by the elite raconteur in Southwestern humor is basically, yet again, our old friend, the clown or the jester, and his modern-day analog is, of course, as I never tire of repeating, the stand-up comedian. Now, Professor Cohen states that Southwestern humor contains much that is repellent, racist, and sexist. It battens on brutality and squalor, but reveals a lust for life, a firm grip on reality, its basic compassion. And again, if Americans have any culture at all, it is their practical nature as opposed to their idealistic longings. I guess it comes from a frontier mentality allied to an idealistic age of reason political philosophy, which the American is imbued with and has been since the time of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. Now, Professor Cohen states, when the narrator abandoned his gentlemanly pose and made the characters themselves speak, he was laying the foundations for a new style of American writing, rich in similes, metaphors, exaggerations, characterized by concreteness, freshness, and color. And these, of course, are the values that a stand-up comedian also has. characterized by concreteness, freshness, and color, rich in similes, metaphors, and exaggerations. Professor Cohen goes on to state that spinning yarns of superhuman hunters and describing animals that possessed fantastic understanding of human beings was one aspect of Southwestern humor. The stories were earthy, shocking to the genteel reader of genteel literature. And, of course, because of that, they have a great deal in common with some of our earthier comedians of the present day. Now, in last week's presentation, and during this week's presentation as well, I stressed that comedy is as old as the Greeks, and that it has its origins in the origins of literature itself, which is to say the epic poem, the drama, the fable, oratory, insult contests, all of these blend in, and you can readily trace the line of descent to stand-up comedy. Professor Cohen talks about Southwestern humor and states, the oral tale passed from one generation to another and remained a rich reservoir of materials. But even though the Southwestern writers were not professionals, they were educated men, self-taught or otherwise, who especially admired the style and wit of such 18th century essayists as Addison, Steele, and Goldsmith, and who were equated with some of the best of classical and modern literature. So not only does Southwestern humor have an oral component, but it also has a certain grounding in the English literature of its day, specifically the essayists. Now, Professor Cohen makes a comparison between the travels of Baron Munchausen and Washington Irving's sketchbook, particularly the story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So I wasn't exactly woofing when I said that Washington Irving had a certain link with European literature, although, of course, he is best remembered as an American writer. Interestingly enough, he spent a good deal of his latter career abroad, as have many American writers, notably Henry James, Ernest Hemingway, for that matter, Mark Twain to a certain extent, and, of course, who could forget the unforgettable what's-his-name? You know the guy I mean. Oh, let's see. Well, anyway, Melville, he spent a good deal of his time abroad. There's a certain exile mentality. Americans seem to feel that they can't really get a grip on their culture unless they spend a good deal of time abroad. It's sort of like Democrats becoming Republicans because they can't dabble in realistic politics until they do. T.S. Eliot was an American writer who spent a good deal of his time in Great Britain. And reversing the flow, W.H. Auden was a British writer who spent a good deal of his time in America. And for that matter, Bertolt Brecht had a certain lengthy sojourn in Hollywood. The graphic artist George Grosz. Back in the 1800s, the flow was from America to England and Europe. And in the 20th century, the flow has generally gone the other way, from England and Europe and other parts of the world to the United States. Professor Cohen states, besides amusing himself and others, the Southwestern frontier humorist was attempting to record realistically local customs and manners and provide a chronicle of the times. This is something that any stand-up comedian should also attempt to do, record realistically local customs and manners and provide a chronicle of the times. The Southwestern humorists generally dealt with scenes and customs out of the immediate past, striving to preserve the picture of an era which was quickly passing away. In that time and place, and to those writers, life was action and movement, and comedy was largely the result of things that happened. The fundamental and lasting appeal of this kind of unsophisticated humor is attested by the continued vitality in literature as well as in motion pictures. How many times have we seen a made-for-TV movie or a Hollywood feature film which had as its subtitle, Based on a True Story. This is, of course, directly traceable to the influence, or at least an influence, of Southwestern humor. Now, this is not to say that there weren't other forms of humor. There was the down-eastern humor of Maine. There was the sophisticated essay style of New England, as exemplified by someone like Oliver Wendell Holmes, whose Autocrat of the Breakfast Table was a big bestseller, or Henry Bailey Aldrich, whose Diary of a Bad Boy was a classic in its time of American boys' literature. But the strongest strain of American humor in fiction has generally been that of Mark Twain, whose Adventures of Huckleberry Finn seems to recur every 10 years or so in a new and more relevant form. 1950s, it was Catcher in the Rye. 1960s, it was Saul Bellows' Adventures of Augie Marsh. There was Good Times, Bad Times by James Kirkwood in the late 60s, early 70s. And, of course, Clockers, a recent novel, which will have to stand as a somewhat of an equivalent of Huckleberry Finn, and many others. Clockers, by the way, by Richard Price, was recently made into a movie by Spike Lee, but you might want to check out the book. It's actually quite interesting. In any event, Professor Cohen states that the world of Southwestern humor is populated with those who do not know all they need to know, and the tension between knowledge and ignorance acts as the essential stimulant to laughter. And of course, there is that whole strain of comedy which depends upon the fake naivete of its interlocutor in order to wring laughs out of the audience. And as I stated last week, a comedian generally looks at the world with a child's eyes, but with an adult's point of view. And there is another tension. Comedy is basically about tension, walking a tightrope between two, sometimes diametrically opposed poles. Another tension, says Professor Cohen, the head-on meeting of the humorous and serious. The reader knows how ridiculous such exaggerations are, and yet he half wishes that such wild and illogical, unbounded wonders could be true. Now, in its modern-day form, the stand-up comedian also relies upon this contrast between ridiculous exaggeration and yet a seeming plausibility that makes the people listening wish that somehow these things were in fact true and real. Now, Professor Cohen says, under the almost savage conditions of a wild new land, laughter was one of the means by which the frontiersman could for a time forget his hardship, preserve his courage, and retain his balance and humanity. Through his tall tales and his exaggerated, at times almost bestial behavior, he could laugh at himself and know at the same time that he was playing a role, that his civilized self remained intact beneath the half-man, half-alligator comic facade he created. It was a self-imposed mask, assumed for the purpose of contrasting the true self with the mask. He had attracted the attention of the outside world too, and he was acting for it as well as for himself. These men formed a new kind of literature, chiefly anecdotal in nature, but with a freshness in language and a boldness of detail which stands as a foundation of modern American writing, and, of course, to a certain degree, can also be traced to modern American comedy. These writers, says Professor Cohen, had the wit to realize that something old in talking might look new in writing. In other words, they took these tall tales that were passed down from generation to generation, slapped a patina of gentility onto it by use of a genteel narrator, and remade them into a viable literary form, if not high literature, at least a valid and intrinsically American literary form. Now, Professor Cohen discusses the subjects of Southwestern humor. The hunt, fights, mock fights, and animal fights, courtings, weddings, and honeymoons, frolics and dances, games, horse races, and other contests, militia drills, elections and electioneering, the legislature and the courtroom, sermons, camp meetings, and religious experiences, the visitor in a humble home, the country boy in the city, the riverboat, adventures of the rogue, pranks and tricks of the practical joker, gambling, trades and swindles, cures, sickness, bodily discomfort and medical treatments, drunks and drinking, dandies, foreigners, and city slickers, and oddities and local eccentrics. Now, a great many of these have come down today. For example, the courtings, weddings, and honeymoons of the Southwestern humorist can be transmogrified into the present-day comedian's talk of relationships. The frontierman's obsession with games can be found to have an analog in the present-day comedian's obsession with talking about sports and politics. And that is, if that is one of his obsessions. Bill Cosby once did an entire record of nothing but sports-related material, which I haven't listened to. I'm not really that interested in sports, but someday I'll have to give it a listen just to see how he handles that single subject. But the country boy in the city slicker in the country, well, these have come down to us as sitcoms. For example, Green Acres and the Beverly Hillbillies. Drunks and drinking, well, that for a while had its analog in the drug humor of the 70s, but eventually that became passé. And of course, the late Dean Martin epitomized the drunken humor, which was so much a part of the frontier humor of the American Southwest, which, to remind you, ran roughly from 1820 to 1860. Of course, by around the time of the Civil War, people began looking outside for their entertainment, and so there came traveling circuses, medicine shows, religious revivals, freak shows that eventually became vaudeville, and then silent movies and sound movies, radio, nightclub comedy, television, coffeehouse humor, comedy, beatniks and the like, and gong shows, and of course the comedy clubs of the 1980s. You see, Americans may differ in where they go to find the teller of tales, but they don't differ in their impulse to seek out these individuals. And to that degree, Southwestern humor still imbues American humor in general. Now, talking a little bit about the differences between traditional American humor and traditional British humor, Walter Redfern points out, Americans wanted to disassociate themselves from the British, especially in so personal a matter as the sense of humor. Accordingly, early Americans developed what is perhaps an even lower type of humor, cacography, deliberate misspelling for humorous effect as a popular common form. An example of some of the practitioners, names basically long forgotten, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, Seba Smith, James R. Lowell, J.J. Hooper, Artemus Ward. I spoke a little about this last week. In an oral culture, says Maurice Cheney in his book Comedy High and Low, in an oral culture, the sounds are literally the basic units of meaning, with almost unlimited possibilities of punning. The awareness of spelling tends to restrict the free play of comic imagination. Even today, if you'll read a magazine like The Spectator, published in London, a great many of the cartoons published in that inestimable publication are, in fact, based on puns and wordplay. And in fact, a great many of them are taken directly from that week's headlines. By the late 1830s, Jim Crow displaced the backwoods or frontier caricature, and Zip Coon or Jim Dandy replaced the Yankee character as America's central comic figures. In the second part of the minstrel show, the olio or variety segment, the comedy highlight was the stump speaker, a lone comic who stood and delivered a discourse that ranged from pure nonsense to supposedly serious lectures on some social or philosophical issue. Now, we're talking the late 1830s, and here is yet another direct ancestor of the modern day stand-up comedian. And I have cited here an example of the stump speaker who appeared in the second part of the minstrel show called the Olio. Feller fellers and udder fellers, when Jonah Ark and his brother Noah's Ark crossed the Rubicon in church of Coran's horn, and meeting that solitary horseman by the way, they manipulated in declaring tones of the clamorous rooster the insignification of the hot toad. Is an example of the stump speaker, the humor of the stump speaker in the minstrel show. Of course, as I reiterated, the stump show eventually, the minstrel show eventually gave way to vaudeville. Eventually, in the stump show, in the minstrel show, a little of the hard luck of the Negro began to creep in. If he was a buffoon, he was a buffoon wearing his rue. A slight, very slight quality of the harlequin began to attach to him, the traditional clown of the traveling European commedia dell'arte, the clown, the jester, the fool figure in general. He was the clown making light of his troubles, but he was a wounded, a sorely beset clown. This is Jesse Fawcett on the comic Harnett Hogan. Jesse Fawcett, who wrote a book on the minstrel show, goes on to talk about Pigmeat Markham, whom some of you might remember. For Pigmeat Markham, blackface makeup served the same purpose as the grease paint and bulbous false nose worn by circus clowns. Remember that traveling circuses and medicine shows were a feature of early American humor. Blackface not only functioned objectively as a humorous mask, but also worked subjectively to permit Pigmeat Markham to step outside of himself and into a stage character. He felt naked without it and was anxious about abandoning it. Well, I don't know, it's some kind of silly to rely on a mask in order to create a comic persona, wouldn't you say? Kind of a crutch. It's really too bad. Now, Braun Weber states that the dominant tradition of Anglo-American culture, which since the 18th century has believed that humor is intrinsically good-natured, trivial, and kindly, this was a dominant tradition of Anglo-American culture, to use a tautology, since that was in fact a sentence fragment. And eventually, American humor evolved, or perhaps regressed, from the frontier humor, which was earthy and specific and concrete. Eventually, Tony Hendra states in his book Going Too Far, eventually acts flourished by kneading the public into a pleasant stupor. Of course, one of the forms of this rather hackneyed humorous form was the comic drunk, whose misadventures are more amusing than pitiable and certainly not tragic. The comic drunk became the accepted substitution for the blackface comedian, which by the end of the 1940s was beginning to look a bit inapropos in light of the growing civil rights movement. Now, Roy Blount Jr. discusses Southern humor, which of course is directly descended from humor of the Old Southwest. Southern humor tends to be mixed in with violence, heartbreak, preachment, politics, libidinousness, gustation, anger, nostalgia, racial conflict, and adventure. In the South, humor, like argumentativeness in New York, isn't so much a specialization as a requisite element in discourse, and Southern humor tends to work best when it isn't trying to be any funnier than life and death are. Now, you just look at someone like Jeff Foxworthy and tell me that Southern humor no longer exists. Another thing about Southern humor, says Roy Blount Jr., is its orality. Southern writing abounds in phonetic relish. Southern humor almost always sounds like people talking on the page. And for that, you might, in look to, now who's that fellow that used to do the movies, and now he is a commentator in magazines like Editorial Humor? Joe Bob Briggs, who has a book called The Cosmic Humor of Joe Bob Briggs. You will note the outstanding vernacular quality of the work of Joe Bob Briggs. Now, talking a little bit about the history of American humor outside of the Southwestern tradition, I am citing Charles Oliver, who states that in the 19th century and for the first few decades of this century, carnivals crisscrossed the United States, providing entertainment to people in small towns. Carnivals catered to the dark side of man's need for spectacle by allowing people to escape temporarily from their dull, everyday lives into a world that was dark, sleazy, and seemingly dangerous. Of course, the danger wasn't real, and the ultimate lure of the carnival was that you could safely return from its world into your everyday life. Now, there are certain analogs here, of course, to Disneyland, which is basically just a sanitized carnival, and to talk shows, which basically are the old-time carnival freak show, but without any physical freaks per se. Now, James Wood observes that for much of this century, English literature has been at furtive war with the American pretender. It has become a fight for the throne, a race to see who would lead the age. As English literature has lost that race, so it has become defensive. The scepter is turned into a baton, and the English have been unwilling to hand it over. Virginia Woolf in 1925 conceded that the Americans were now like the Elizabethans, coining new words. In England, she thought the word-coining power had lapsed, yet she judged American literature as an expressive, ugly, vigorous slang, and hoped that the English influence might well predominate. But convalescent and timorous English fictional prose has seemed unwilling to take the contemporary air, which of course would mean that it would be just like the Southwestern humor of the 1830s, which is hardly contemporary. This is not my place to discuss British humor, except as how it contrasts to American humor. Edmund Wilson, in his Patriotic Gore, writes of American prose and develops the argument that American writing abandoned the cultivated standards of the 18th century and in the first half of the 19th century fell into deplorable exaggeration and rhetorical display arising from models such as the sermon and the public address. In Wilson's view, it took the Civil War to return American prose to the virtues of sobriety, terseness, lucidity, and precision. Now, Edmund Wilson, in his book The Wound and the Bowl, wrote of the Sophocles play Philoctetus, and the thematic tenor of Philoctetus is that the sufferings and the traumas of the lives of artists have deep connections with the release of creativity. And once again, this circles all the way back to the wound that comics feel that causes them to express themselves in the way they do, which of course is merely a smaller subset of the way literary practitioners feel obliged to express themselves in general. Now, there has been a feel-good strain of American humor. C.J. Jung stated that sentimentality is a superstructure covering brutality. Oberon Waugh goes on to state that underneath this smothering American sentimentality lies a certain curious hard-heartedness. American writers are aware of the constant pressure to cut out anything abrasive or controversial, which seems to deny a world peace, and love. The only way they can face their smoldering underclass. And of course, we need look no further than the average sitcom. At this time, it might profit us to discuss various forms of ethnic humor. Not necessarily ethnic humor itself, but ethnic groups and their distinctive forms of humor. Of course, there's the Italian Catholic form of humor. Camille Paglia has said that Italian Catholicism is a rich ethnic identity rather than a religion. In other words, it is a separate and discrete culture, and because it is a culture, there arises the possibility of literature and of humor. People often ask, why are there so many Jewish comedians? Again, it's a case of a rich ethnic identity, in this case, in addition to a religion, which creates a culture which feeds literature. So, when we talk about how Americans have no distinct culture, we might have to be very careful in making such a blanket statement and qualify it by saying that Americans have many discrete cultures and they're all blended together in, some say, a melting pot, others would say a putrid stew. Norman Holland put it this way: Jews tell Jewish jokes, soldiers joke about death and army food, hospital patients tell jokes about being flat on one's back. Americans' jokes are apparently more aggressive than those of other nationalities. Different cultures choose different subjects for jokes. The Chinese joke about social relationships. Non-literate cultures joke about the immediate physical environment. The West jokes about sex and aggression. Now, Ralph Ellison, who frequently in his essays has a great deal of value to say concerning humor, states, cultural heritage imposes the uneasy burden and occasional joy of a complex double vision, a fluid ambivalent response to men and events which represents at its finest a profoundly civilized adjustment to the cost of being human in the modern world. So in other words, if you have a cultural heritage, not only can you create humor from it, but you can create humor from outside of it. In other words, you're in it and you're creating humor by pulling in its elements, and yet you're outside of it, and because you're outside of it, you can create humor from that place and not necessarily from being outside of it. But because you're outside of it, you have a place from which to create it. Now, Ralph Ellison goes on to discuss black humor. Black humor, like Jewish humor, perhaps the most prominent influence on the American humor tradition, is in many ways shaped by the minority status of its creators. And once again, as I stated last week, and perhaps already stated this week, comedy is basically the story of me versus the world. Ellison goes on to state, black comedians, like blues artists, primarily focused on the immediate problems of their day-to-day existence: friendships, finances, marital and sexual relationships, the pleasures of eating and drinking. Other comedians wrung laughter from their ability to deflect hostilities from themselves and maintain their tough, haughty posture as someone else suffered the consequences of their actions. Well, the American joke. We will talk momentarily about the American joke. The comic images created by America's frantic search for a national identity that has been a preoccupation ever since the first colonists, severed from their past and forced to confront an uncertain future, landed on these shores. So although I stated earlier that you can't rightfully say that American culture is in the fact that it has no culture, to a certain degree, American culture comes from the search for a unified culture, which it lacks because of its polyglot nature. Ralph Ellison writes that this search for a culture gave Americans an ironic awareness of the joke that always lies between appearance and reality, between the discontinuity of social tradition and that sense of the past which clings to the mind. That ironic awareness that Ralph Ellison discusses can be found in its present form in the postmodernist, culture-heavy, pop culture-laden standoffishness that we find so often in the products of the East Coast and the West Coast, mainly television situation comedies, which are basically self-referential, highly ironic. The verbal incongruity between the formal, higher ideas of democracy and the informal language of everyday life and ordinary people is emblematic of the nature and problem of democracy and persuasively documents the importance of humor in understanding the growth and development of American democracy. So in other words, you have the idealism that we speak of that characterizes the American linked to the practicality, and the humor arises from the incongruity of the two meshing. In other words, people who are all for democracy as long as it isn't for the other fellow, but only for them. Now, Langston Hughes has said, humor boomerangs. Things are often funny because we don't know we're laughing at ourselves. But what's funny in America, and this is something that was pointed out by Martin Huygen, according to American etiquette, stand-up comedians can make ethnic jokes only about their own ethnic groups. And that's because you have a polyglot culture, yet although it is intrinsically American because of its polyglot nature, and it's intrinsically democratic because it treats all of these polyglot groups equally, at least in theory, because the bonds that bind Americans to one another aren't by blood, but rather by a theory called democracy. Because of that, people are still sensitive about their ethnic identity and the culture of their own groups, and so it is still considered tacitly offensive to make jokes about an out-group, because that smacks of a person in a position of power persecuting people who are not in a position of power. The Clown Code of Ethics, according to Barbara Emile, covers such topics as professional conduct in public and reminds clowns to play practical jokes on each other rather than the audience. And we might add, it reminds comedians to play practical jokes on their own groups, to make humorous material out of their own culture, their subculture, rather than try to attack the broader culture, or, although that's permissible, but what is not permissible is to take someone from another culture and try to stigmatize them for being a member of an outgroup. The modernist mentality, aspiring to universal domination, ranges from cosmology to sexuality, and everywhere it's overweeningly arrogant. And when we talk about the modernist mentality, what we're basically talking about is a cast of mind and character. Now, to contrast, British comedy has always been hilarious, according to Barbara Emile, in its political incorrectness. It's not that they want to make a big deal out of being politically incorrect, but it naturally arises that they do things that no one in Canada or America would dare touch it. That's because they're not a polyglot culture. They are English, and they don't risk offending out groups because there is no out group except one that they all mutually share. In other words, there's nobody in the crowd saying, hey, that's not funny, because they're all English. And the person telling the joke is English, and it may not be funny, but nobody's going to jump up and say that it isn't funny because nobody's offended. Because it is a unified culture. At this time, I will take a short break, review my notes, and return with the conclusion of tradition. Second in a series of comic tradition, humor and comedy in the American tradition. A presentation by The Wrong Hero. Thank you for bearing with me, although, of course, according to what you saw, I was only gone for a second. Anyhow, talking more about American society and the structure of American society and how it pertains to comedy and how Americans have no culture and yet comedy is impossible in a society which has no culture. William H. Gass, the novelist, asks, does the structure of society, its classes, fashions, mores, patterns of behavior, merely serve to bandage and hide pathology? A very pertinent question. John Updike states that Orthodox religion scarcely figures at all, even as a force to be reacted against in contemporary American fiction. So, Americans don't really have religion as a unifying force, and they don't necessarily even have a literary culture as a unifying force, but what they do have is the structure of their society as a unifying force, which is why you can always make jokes about policemen and get a laugh, because that deals with the structure of our society. You can make jokes about the boss because that is the structure of our society. Even mother-in-law jokes, although those have become passé and have more or less been replaced with relationship jokes or jokes about the relationships between one employee and another, one friend and another, or jibes at politicians. All of these deal not so much with American culture, but with the structure of American society. And it's, of course, a very fertile field, because you can make jokes about the upper class, or if you're daring, you can make jokes about the lower class. You can make jokes about fashion, or if you wish to be tiresome, you can make jokes about people who are mired in the fashions of the past. You can make jokes about the patterns of people's behavior. This is a very fertile field for the comedian. The jokes about the patterns of people's behavior. The officious politician is always a good stock in trade, a stereotypical stock in trade, and the tyrannical boss and the overweening policeman. In other words, lacking a all-encompassing culture, Americans replace it with a society type of mindset, a structural mindset, which basically the comic is the little man opposing the forces of authority. Now, according to Donald Lyons, in the 1970s, the personal became the political, the psychic became the civic. The reigning culture urged people to isolate one aspect of their life, race, sexual preference, to identify themselves with it, and make demands on the body politic in its name. Now, in other words, what he's talking about is the fragmentation of a unified culture, as though such ever existed, um, into little subsets, subgroups, subcultures. Donald Lyons goes on to state about the playwright Larry Kramer that he is characterized by an uncritical self-absorption which transcends mere egomania. That is often the case with actors, playwrights, writers in general, and comedians, for that matter. An uncritical absorption, self-absorption, which transcends mere egomania. Now, Alexis de Tocqueville, that fellow who commentators never tire of quoting, even though he wrote in the 1840s, and the reason they never tire of quoting him is because many of the things he says are true even today, as the following quote. Alexis de Tocqueville has said, "It will sometimes happen that members of the literary class, always living amongst themselves and writing for themselves alone, will entirely lose sight of the rest of the world, which will infect them with a false and labored style. Such are the natural perils of literature among the aristocracy. Every aristocracy that keeps itself entirely aloof from the people becomes impotent, a fact which is as true in literature as politics. Every aristocracy that keeps itself entirely aloof from the people becomes impotent." Now, you talk about televised variety shows of the 1960s, or you talk about beltway politicians, and that's still every bit as true today. Now, Michael Kinsley refers to the brazen self-reinvention as being one of the great themes of American literature. And sometimes that self-reinvention takes the form of a calcified mentality, or at least it results in a calcified mentality. How many times have we seen the firebrand 60s radical become the pompous businessman of the 1980s? Jerry Rubin, for example. Mark Stein states that in America there is no counterculture. Everyone just gets absorbed into the lunch counterculture, all lined up side by side and immediately available. The fact that the constituent parts don't go together is no obstacle. Now, of course, he is a British person, but he's writing from the point of view of a person living in America, if I mistake me not, and that's a very prescient observation that there is no counterculture because there really is no culture. The counterculture per se, just like the American Prohibition movement per se, sort of had a short reign, and it wasn't really a reign at all. I think for a while it might have reached 60%, but not of all people, mind you, just of a certain group. And then it just sort of faded away, and it was yesterday's news, and nobody wanted to hear about it. Much like the Prohibition movement, which had its heyday from the end of the First World War to 1933. Mark Stein goes on to write about how attitude is style and pose separated from any true emotional response. And ever since Elvis Presley, we've had corporate continuity masquerading as permanent revolution. Now, these are pretty weighty things. What he seems to be getting at is that in the absence of a culture, we have a climate of celebrities taking the place of other cultural figures. But even those celebrities who made their name as opposing establishment viewpoints eventually got co-opted into the greater mainstream. And I'll repeat, ever since Elvis Presley, we've had corporate continuity masquerading as permanent revolution. However, to provide some balance to this rather mean-spirited assessment of American culture and counterculture, we have Philip Terzian, who states, "People have been shaking their heads about American vulgarity and greed since before the founding of the Republic. In the 1750s, Puritans bemoaned their vanishing holy experiment. In the 1880s, novelists saw the collapse of civilization in the triumph of capital during the Gilded Age. In the 1950s, television writers regarded their Eden as having been invaded by the serpent of Madison Avenue. In the 1990s, journalists have taken up the chorus. So we don't have a culture per se. What do we have? In a democracy, an elite culture is by definition almost not going to hold sway over the hearts and minds of a nation of 260 million people, but we do have a pop culture which is known not only to many Americans, but to many people around the world. And Greil Marcus states that pop culture is about shared access to a feeling in a world that keeps people separate and feeling at a distance. And that is why so many comedians rely upon references to pop culture in order to make themselves understood to a broader audience. People who tend to be habitués of comedy clubs are very much attuned to pop culture sensibilities. Michael Lewis has something to say about the Great Heartland, something very interesting. Because, of course, comedy clubs have their strongholds in places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, and Boston, although Los Angeles and New York are the comedy central centers. In the Midwest, it's terra incognita. I mean, there are scattered settlements, but to a certain extent, the Midwest, as far as comedy is concerned, is still the frontier, with the possible exceptions of Atlanta and Chicago. Of course, Atlanta's in the South, but I think you know what I'm getting at. The Midwest, says Michael Lewis, is the straight man of the Western world. Millions and millions of square miles, peopled with abbots without their Costellos. It's not that Midwesterners lack a sense of humor, it's just that they regard humor as second-rate behavior, the opposite rather than a complement to seriousness. It's no wonder that professional Midwestern humorists, Garrison Keillor, David Letterman, have the feel of men who have spun out of some orbit. As you can see, American comedy faces a great many obstacles because of the ambiguous nature of the culture in which it plies its trade, the ever-shifting terrain of its milieu. Now, Sarah Kerr says something very interesting about the broader popular culture, which has taken the place of it's taken the place of not only the culture, but the formation of a culture, if in fact there ever was a culture to be formed after around 1800. Broad popular culture in 1945 was every bit as lame as it is now. The difference being that the mood then was a saccharine innocence, while the current cliche is an equally facile and one-dimensional cynicism. So basically, what we see is the triumph of one strain of American humor, the cynical, aloof, ironic, distanced, pop cultural strain of American humor, as opposed to the sentimental and lulling and stupefying and genial strain of older forms of humor, say Yankee humor. So in other words, it's Yankee humor is in the past. The Southwestern humor, to a certain degree, has also been left in the dust, and it's really the humor, the rat-a-tat humor of cynical Hollywood comedies of the 1930s, which is holding sway. Now, I would like to discuss a growing movement in Great Britain called alternative comedy. But before I do, perhaps I should also discuss a little bit about the history of American vaudeville, so that you would have some sort of background against which to assess the new strain of humor which is arising eventually, if it hasn't already, reach these shores, known as alternative comedy. To a certain degree, it's already something of a movement down in New York. Now, let us suppose that vaudeville represents one strain of American humor which still has a certain influence in comedy clubs today. You can trace the stance and even the sense of timing and the syntax of the modern day stand-up comedian to virtually one person, and that is Groucho Marx. And Groucho Marx was a vaudeville performer who eventually appeared in comic plays on the Broadway stage and eventually went to Hollywood. You have the Groucho Marx strain of comedy, which is still very strong, very powerful, even though it has branched off into many different and differing. You have that as a vaudeville strain of American comedy. Another distinct and separate vaudevillian strain of American comedy is the W.C. Fields strain. Now, I guess that would be exemplified by, whereas the Groucho Marx strain, well, you get that in people like Jay Leno and virtually anybody else you would care to name. But the W.C. Fields strain, it's more of a rural medicine show type strain, and that's more exemplified by people like Rodney Dangerfield or Sam Kinison. Whereas the fast, neurotic rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat is seen in people like Jay Leno or even in people who like do the exact opposite of it. They're still influenced by it, like Stephen Wright or Woody Allen. There's that sort of neurotic strain that branches off from the rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat fast-talking comic. Then you have the W.C. Fields strain, which is more the aggrieved individual versus the world. Both Groucho Marx and the Marx Brothers and W.C. Fields emerged out of vaudeville. And American vaudeville, according to Robert Louis Taylor in his book W.C. Fields, His Follies and Fortunes, American vaudeville was in fact born in Boston in 1883. A circus employee, Benjamin Franklin Keith, grew tired of freak shows and lions and trapeze artists and strongmen and fat ladies. Benjamin Franklin Keith, a former circus employee, rented an empty candy store in Boston and hung up a sign, Gaiety Museum, with attractions like a midget and a fake mermaid. He soon added to his cast a pair of comedians, Joe Weber and Lou Fields, and a chicken with a human face. I wonder which one was top billed. He launched the idea of continuous performances. He had a bias against smut. He formed in 1885 a company with Edward F. Albee to present at popular prices the plays and operettas of Gilbert and Sullivan. Of course, this spread, first to Providence, eventually to New York and Chicago, and soon all over the country. And by 1911, when Keith died, vaudeville was the most widely attended stage entertainment in the United States and Canada. And by 1928, which arguably represents vaudeville's peak, by 1928 more than 1,000 vaudeville theaters showed their acts to 2 million people daily. This, in fact, at a time when I believe the population of the United States was like 120 million people. So that would be roughly analogous to an entertainment which reaches 4 million people a day. Not, mind you, television, but a stage presentation. We have nothing like that today. Taylor goes on to talk about vaudeville and says, for the most part, vaudeville rested on songs, dances, short dramatic sketches, and acrobatic turns. The acts followed one another in quick succession with no continuity and only a token effort at arrangements, sort of like the modern day open mic. It was the custom to open with a dumb act, one which involved no spoken lines, such as tumblers or teeter-board specialists, or for instance, jugglers such as W.C. Fields. It was the custom to open with a dumb act so that the noisy late entrance of patrons would have a minimum disturbing effect. In general, similar acts were spaced apart, and some attempt was made to build the show towards a climax by weighting the latter part of it with the most effective performers. Again, your typical comedy show with more than 3 individuals involved does the same thing. The large theaters had a bristling complement of sets and properties which were available to all the visiting artists, but most acts carried the bulk of their own mechanical devices, special scenic effects, and additional decorations. Robert Louis Taylor states that the trunks, boxes, crates, and other luggage which came tumbling out at the stage door epitomized sophistication to the rural audiences who gathered round before the opening of every show in the vaudeville theater. Now, we all know, because I've probably said it more times than necessary, that the teller of tall tales around the campfire eventually evolved into the minstrel show, and the second half of the minstrel show featured the stump speaker, and, well, eventually minstrelry went its way and was replaced by vaudeville, and eventually vaudeville died and was replaced by any of a number of live entertainments. Dance marathons in the 1930s, nightclubs in the 1940s. There was, of course, television in the 50s. There was coffee houses and gong shows, and in the 1980s, comedy clubs. In the 1990s, perhaps we will begin to see, by the end of the decade, people who rent loft spaces or who create their own stages to present, say, storytelling marathons or poetry slams, for that matter, or perhaps the field of alternative comedy will begin to make a dent on American comedy in general. Now, I am citing Paul Billick in the New Statesman and Society for December 8th, 1995, and I am quoting him at length. But before I do, perhaps I will get some more water. Part of the reason I wish to discuss this alternative comedy trend which is arising in Great Britain is because even if it never does catch fire here, what Paul Billick has to say has a great deal of pertinence to any discussion of stand-up comedy. Paul Billick states, alternative is a movement away from familiar, complacent formulas and set jokes, the pushing of imaginative material to absurd extremes, the rejection of a certain category of so-called tastelessness, mainly working class, for a different variety, rebellious middle class. Alternative has mellowed to embrace tradition. Nonsense still exists. Slapstick remains a dirty word, while its euphemism, physical humor, more analytical, is tops. Outrageous is fine, but blue, which is to say smutty, is passé. Jokes confirming homosexual stereotypes are liberating, but heterosexual stereotypes are oppressive. Foul-mouthed female comics go down great guns, male obscenity less so. Comedy is constantly on trial for its political respectability. And yet, all parties are still dealing in the inbred techniques of getting an audience to love you. For comics old and new, the key is the business of exclusion. Even among a live audience, the first 3 rows see a different show from the rest of the hall. The summit of this pyramid of exclusion is the joke the comic makes for himself, his laughing at his own censured thought, which is guaranteed to have the audience in stitches. We also want to belong to the comic's private club, and ultimately the only member of that club is the comic himself. We allow ourselves to be frog-marched into laughter because we are so ready to trust the comic, and so end up back in the suspect relation between comic and punter that alternative comedy was meant to overhaul. But let the audience into your parlor and they'll do the washing up for you. Paul Bielak has a great deal to say about not only alternative comedy per se, which tends to deal less in stereotypical one-liners and jokes and more in a sort of storyteller's medium, but he also has a lot to say about comedy in general, and I quote him again. For the trust to work, the comic must prove he inhabits the same world as his audience, so that the same nostalgias are recognized. The debris of civilization, the bits that don't add up. This seems to be where comedy links up with high rather than with popular literary culture, which tends to deal in already registered cliches of perception and imagery and a world in which everything makes sense. Rather than literature opening its arms to comedy, it's a case of comedy moving to shelter serious literature in its generous cloak. The comic is becoming the surest commentator we have for our gospel. The best laughs come from bold statements that echo our bewilderment at a crazy society. Comics become champions of the repressed on the way home from the office audience. Now, I might like to repeat one segment of that. The best laughs come from bold statements that echo our bewilderment at a crazy society. Not, mind you, a crazy cultural sensibility, but a crazy society. That is perhaps as succinct a comment about comedy, at least as practiced today, as I have ever heard. Now, to round this discussion out, a great flaw in the presentation of many comedians starting out, I hate to say this, it pegs me as an old duffer, and I should say in my own defense that I didn't start doing stand-up comedy until I was 28 years old, is that a lot of young comedians just don't have any real life experience to create comedy out of. It's like what was stated about country and western country and western music in the February 5th, 1996 issue of the New Republic, that people don't really get country and western music until they've been knocked around a little bit. You have to be like 22 or 23 years old in order to really relate to country music, and I think to a certain degree you have to be knocked around a little bit to create comedy. At least comedy which is original, deals with topics that are not necessarily those of the standard cliched, stereotypical comic in front of a brick wall. Comedy that has something of the comedian's personality to it. You have to have been knocked around a little bit. Now, apropos of that, I would like to quote Carl J. Levesque, who states, "Living before starting to write will allow the writing to flourish." Thomas Mann has said that only the creatively exhaustive is truly interesting. And I studied under Alexander Thoreau back in college, and he said something somewhat similar, although not really apropos of the same topic. He wrote short humorous pieces, and he told me his technique was to find out everything he possibly could about a topic and make a list. In other words, sort of like a top 10 list. And just totally exhaust the possibilities of it. And then, from that, you can winnow it down into something which is truly humorous. Terry Teachout has said that a philosophy that has no room for laughter is not worthy of the name. And this harkens back to my perhaps self-serving commentary that comedy and the broader literature from which it springs are not necessarily inseparable. Comedy is as old as literature itself. Now, a mistake that a great many comics, and for that matter, beginning comics and beginning writers make is that they figure if it actually happened, it must be good. But as Beatrice Wood so succinctly put it, the obvious is not art. And although you might get a laugh with jokes about Star Trek, it's not art. It's just vulgar pandering to a lowest common denominator mentality. Beatrice Wood goes on to state, 3 things have meaning for me. Honesty, which I think is vital, freeing oneself from one's own cunning, then a feeling for other people, compassion. That's very hard because artists are very self-absorbed with their own visions. See, it's the old dichotomy, which I discussed last week, of the guy who sits around all day and writes and doesn't interact with other people because he's afraid that the interaction with other people is going to take time away from his precious writing. But you not only want to have it both ways, you have to have it both ways. You can't really create without some interaction with other humans, Emily Dickinson notwithstanding. Or what you do create will be so far ahead of its time that no one will understand it for 50 years. Louis Aragon said something very striking. He said, new myths are born beneath each of our steps. You have to be out there in the world in order to create visions of that world. The power of art's sometimes terrifying menace is what William Styron said. He was talking about Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, which of course is a fine comic novel and a living proof that there is no topic which comedy cannot treat. One of the few sure things the writer knows, says Nadine Gordimer, one of the few sure things the writer knows is that inconsistency is the consistency of human character. And that's where comedy gets a great deal of its material. From the fact, I'm beginning to sound like Bill Cosby here, with these long pauses, which are indicative not of a desire to emulate Bill Cosby, but my absolute and utter exhaustion as we round out this 2-hour Sprachspiel. The thing that stirs us in any man's writing is the man himself, a thing quite outside the page and for which the man is not responsible. I think the same can be said for comedy. The thing that really stirs us, gets us all excited and hyper about going to see a comedian or watching a comedian, is not so much the material, although of course that's a good part of it, but the man himself or the woman herself. Now, John Updike says that a writer's task is not to describe his work, but to call it into being. And I think that's about as succinct a way of putting it as possible. Now I'd like to go back to something I cited earlier, also by John Updike. John Updike says, the United States, democratic and various though it is not an easy country for a fiction writer to enter. The slot between the fantastic and the drab seems too narrow. An outlandish literary stance is traditional. Such masterpieces as Moby Dick and Huckleberry Finn deal with marginal situations and eccentric, rootless characters. Many American writers have gone into exile to find subjects of a congenial color and dignity. The Puritanism and practicality of the earlier settlers imposed a certain enigmatic dullness, it may be, upon the nation's affective life and social texture. Note, he doesn't say culture, he says upon its affective life and social texture. The minimization of class distinctions suppressed one of the articulating elements of European fiction, and a close, delighted grasp of the psychology of sexual relations. So important in French and English novels, came slowly amid the New World's austerities. Well, once again, to cite Nadine Gordimer, responsibility is what waits outside the Eden of creativity. And once again, I will take a short break. Well, as we wind down this second of a 10-week series on humor and comedy in the American tradition, I would like to make some closing statements, introduce some concepts for I don't know, for you to grind around in the gears of your mind. Richard Dawkins cites a notion called memes, or M-E-M-E-S, memes, memes, which are cultural ideas which propagate themselves. Well, for example, the inefficiency of bureaucracies, the cold-heartedness of big city life, and whatnot. Comedy really relies on memes to achieve its fullest effect. It takes assumptions which are regarded as everyday ones and subversively attempts to turn them inside out. As Gerald Goodman, professor of psychology at UCLA, once stated, the drive to be known, to be deeply understood by another human, is almost as strong as our sex and hunger drives. And that's what the comedian is up there doing, by expressing himself in terms of where he stands in his society, and by using these memes, these cultural assumptions which everybody shares, or which seemingly everybody is at least familiar with. He is attempting to be known, to be understood, almost to take a shortcut towards being deeply understood. Eunice Lipton said that making paintings is like making books. It's hard work done by fairly ordinary, if self-absorbed people. And the same is true of comedy. It's hard work done by fairly ordinary, if self-absorbed people. Kingsley Amis put it another way. He said, "Importance isn't important. Only good writing is." Paul Johnson states that the need to invent is the greatest of all restraints under which an artist operates. Inhibitions, such as artistic canons, force an artist to think hard, to mobilize his intellectual resources in the permitted areas, and to operate confidently within them. All great art, and especially innovative art, needs a canonical straitjacket. Artists on whom no rules are imposed are usually lost. Insofar as innovation is possible in the field of comedy, insofar as comedy operates under any canonical straitjacket at all, it is in fact what I'll call the tyranny of the laugh. You have got to get the laugh. And if you do not, you are not doing the job of comedy, which is in fact a very difficult job, which requires a lot of hard work. Arthur Miller says that the truth, the first truth probably, is that we are all connected, watching one another, even the trees. He also says, A failure to imagine will make us die. He talks about the imploding of time, moments when a buried layer of experience suddenly surges upward to become the new surface of one's attention and flashes news from below. And of course, the comic monologue depends very much on the artificially created imploding of time, the moments when a buried layer of experience, at least seemingly, suddenly surges upward to become the new surface of one's attention and flashes news from below. That's what comedians do when they memorize their monologues. They make it seem as though all of these things are just floating to the surface at that very moment. And as a matter of fact, once you have enough material internalized, that material will in fact float to the surface like those buried memories, which Arthur Miller discusses. Arthur Miller also states that there must also be at least one righteous man or the whole human city will go up in smoke, one whistleblower, so to speak, or our conventional lies will sink everything. And that is one of the roles of the comic. Of course, a comedian has to be many things, not merely a teller of jokes, but a comedian should also have other skills, say musical, the ability to sing, the ability to move around stage, to do impressions, to do sleight of hand. A comedian's job is not simply that of getting up there and telling jokes, but perhaps the most important job that a comedian has is that he is the righteous man, the whistleblower, the person who opposes the lies of convention. Arthur Miller also says, the signal job of the artist is to remind people of what they have chosen to forget. And that, to my taste, is in fact a good comedian. Somebody who reminds people of what they have chosen to forget. Arthur Miller goes on to state, we tell stories, create myths, write gospels of every sort because we cannot tolerate the irrational. Absurdity offends us, just because it attacks our sense that there is a reason for our pain. Is all this sadness for nothing? And the human answer comes back again and again. No, it's for something, but it may be for a little bit more than what you were expecting. Actually, that wasn't Arthur Miller, was it? It was Frank McConnell, who also goes on to say, beginning, say, with Shakespeare, we began to realize that the gods had not invented us, but that we were in the process of inventing our gods. But let's get back to the first statement by not Arthur Miller, but Frank O'Connell. We tell stories, create myths, write gospels of every sort, because we cannot tolerate the irrational. And one of the jobs of the comedian is to take the irrational and set it apart from the run of human experience as such, and invite us to find humorous content in it. Once again, I will take this one last break, and we'll be returning. This discussion started out as a discussion of tradition in the subtext of humor and comedy in the American tradition, but in the closing moments I'd like to discuss something which amounts to a little bit more. What various writers have said about their craft. Kingsley Amis has said that the moment you stop writing, you're turning your face to the wall. And he also says that there is a point to art to give other people pleasure. That of course, is one of the great points of comedy. Why do people do comedy? Well, aside from their own motivations, their reward for doing comedy, besides the self-analysis that goes on and the healing of some ancient wound, is to give other people pleasure. It's sort of like the guy in Alcoholics Anonymous who takes his time to bend over backwards to help another fallen soul, and in the process begins the healing process for himself. Gore Vidal says that with time, one picks up all sorts of useful hints about what people do. And that's basically what comedy is about, what people do. Flannery O'Connor has said that she was only trying to see straight, and it's the least you can ask for. You can ask God to let you see straight and write straight. She says also that the artist dreams no dreams. That is precisely what he does not do. And she states, ultimately you write what you can, what God gives you. She goes on to say, later, the writer himself is traveling the rocky road and feels every individual bump. William Burroughs, who is famous for Naked Lunch and Nova Express, has said that writing must always remain an attempt. And that's what comedy is too, to a certain degree, an attempt. Because the comic monologue may be honed to perfection, and yet the good comic will not resist the impulse to attempt to improve it even more. Again, like the person who writes plays for the stage, he has a great deal in common with them, with that impulse to constantly improve. What should I do about everything I know? Write something, says William F. Buckley. In his book, The Wound and the Bow, Edmund Wilson discusses Philoctetes, the victim of a malodorous disease that renders him abhorrent to society and periodically degrades him and makes him helpless, is also the master of a superhuman art which everyone has to respect and which the normal man finds he needs. Now, Wilson, according to Gerald Howard, interpreted the Sophoclean fable of the wounded, abandoned archer Philoctetes as a parable of the artistic condition. I would like to state that I think it is also a parable of the comedian. The victim of a malodorous wound, which renders him abhorrent to society and degrades him and makes him helpless, is also the master of a superhuman art which every man has to respect and which the normal man finds he needs. Graham Greene has said that the disease is also one's material. Cure the disease, and I doubt whether a writer would remain. Success for a writer, says Graham Greene, is always temporary. Success is only a delayed failure, and it is incomplete. And he goes on to state, and I think this will be the closing statement of my presentation, that there is always a splinter of ice in the heart of a writer. I am the wrong hero, and I think next week our discussion will in fact center around a new topic entirely as a part of this 10-week presentation. Next week on Cafe Cabaret we will be presenting the chapter entitled Legend. And the following week we will present the chapter entitled Stand Up.